I wanted to talk about the history of Pawnee governance, but I think Lance and I, in our general, you know, talks about this, we're just wondering if having some kind of a topical get together once in a while would be of interest to people. We'll see if that seems to be of any interest to people as we're, thinking of things to do, ways to get together, and that sort of thing. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about Pawnee history. And so this is an issue that I thought would be of interest. And so, I have some things that I wanted to talk about to get going, but if you guys want to jump in and then feel free to do so. We can have more of a discussion about this issue.
Sounds
Anyway,
good.
where I thought I would start is with a Pawnee word. This word is, I think, the key word when we're looking at the history of Pawnee governance. The word is Resaru in South Band. And in the Skidi dialect, as I understand it, it's very similar. Risaru. So Risaru, Resaru. These are funny words that are often translated as the word for chief. That's how it's often translated. Now, that's not a translation that I use. I experiment with other things. So, what did this word mean to our ancestors who only spoke Pawnee? And when they heard this word, what did it mean? Well, this word has various forms. There's a noun form and a verb form. And the verb form is resar. And this word basically, it means to be esteemed. It means to be regal. And so regal, esteem, leader, chief, these are some of the ideas that are bound up in this word. When we think about how to translate it exactly, it doesn't have an exact translation in my view, because there are other meanings that are more nebulous that are also present in people's minds. And this word got spoken long ago.
Now that's a term for who or for what?
It's translated as chief. And so today it's used for Nasharo Council. Nasharo is that word, but in the South Band dialect, it's pronounced the Resaru.
Right, but who would it be applied to?
To leaders of a specific kind. Now, there's a variety of words in the Pawnee languages that refer to leaders of different kinds. And so this is one kind of a leader. What kind of a leader is it? It's community leaders. And so these are leaders who have a specific kind of status. And there are other kinds of leaders and terms that apply to them in the two Pawnee dialects. But this is the word that has come down to mean chief. So it refers to a particular kind of governance tradition, a legacy of ideas that are bound up in this word. Now, in Skidi traditions, for example, the institution of chieftainship, the Risaru, was founded and associated with a person who's got various names. One name is closed man. It simply refers to a male. Another name that is translated as holy person or wonderful person or mysterious person. Another term that's applied to this man is first man. And so this refers to storytelling about the founding of what's called the Skidi Federation. This was a group of communities that existed at an unknown time long ago. They were neighboring communities, and I think that they all spoke the same language or dialects of the same language, and they were scattered over the Central Plains. And this man, in Pawnee, I guess you'd call him something like Ixwaraksti. That means holy person. And so he was the founder of the Skidi Federation. And what he did is he brought together all these small communities from across a broad region into a ceremonial system. And in the course of doing that, they established some formal offices. One of those offices was the Risaru, the chief, the leader, the community leader. Another office was the office of the priesthood. In Pawnee, this is let's see. I can't remember the term for priest right off the bat. Something like Kurao is doctor, and Kura, Kuraus is priest. And so the priesthood and the chieftainship, the leadership, the Risaru, they were established in association with the Skidi Federation. They came together in the course of performing annual ceremonies and bringing together the bundles of these different communities into a regular system. And so this first leader, his skull was attached to a bundle that he had, and it became the Skidi skull bundle. And this was a central shrine for the Federation. And so the leaders of these communities would all get together and hold an annual ceremony and other rituals as well. And so this happened at an unknown time in the distant past. I think this was about 700 years ago. And so that is one system of governance that came into being a long time ago. There was another system that came into being among other related peoples who were living in other places. This other system became known, they became ancestral to the South Band Pawnees. And they were a group in that time period known as the Kawarakis. And so the Kawarakis, they were centered on their own sacred bundle shrine and rituals and ceremonies and traditions associated with that. And they came together to form their own separate system. And ultimately, they split up into different groups, and they were unified under this central shrine comparable to the Skidi Federation. And so we have two concurrent governance systems in ancient times. I think that were in operation over a long time period. And they were centered on this office of the Reisaru. Now, what this word really refers to is something that I think is very interesting. In the Licorice language, this word refers to the creator. It's a word for God, you could say. But in Pawnee ideas, there wasn't an anthropomorphic God, it was a creative life force. And among the Licorice, when they use this word, Reisaru, their version of it, it's a little bit different, but you can recognize it. They're referring to the creative deity life force. So that's what this word refers to. And in Pawnee thinking, what this is intended to do, this word, is to remind people of the relationship between humankind and the celestial powers, the life force, the divinities in the heavens. And what happens in the heavens is reflected on earth. And this is the basic idea that's bound up in this word. And so any translation we would have like leader or chief or, whatever, those terms need to be understood the way that our ancestors would have understood it. This word actually refers to this mirror quality of what happens in the heavens is reflected on earth. And so when these leaders arose and they thought of who they were and their ceremonial systems, they were supposed to enact things that were being done in the heavens, in the celestial realm. And so they envisioned themselves as caring for the people in the same way that the creative divinity cared for all living things on the earth. And so this is a complicated set of ideas that isn't translatable very easily into any kind of a specific term. And so I prefer to think when I hear the word chief, and I know it's supposed to be Reisaru, I think of community leader with celestial blessings. That's what I think of. I think that encompasses a lot more of the meanings that were heard in Pawnee land when
Community
that
leader,
was spoken.
community leader with what?
A community leader with celestial blessings. So that is, in my mind, what this word really refers to. And so when the word began to be, when Pawnee words got translated into English, people had to make choices. Now, the Spanish, when they encountered the Pawnees, they referred to leaders as captains. And the English used a different word. And so there were all these different words, but the word chief became used instead of see, one of the meanings is that this is a word that refers to being regal. It's a word that refers to esteem. And so a person is esteemed for their regal leadership, their regal respected qualities when they reflect the celestial realm and the ideals of the celestial realm. And so that's what these words really encircle. This is the meanings that that should be attached to them when we think of what they are. And so I think that's very important, that these words, they don't translate very easily into a word like chief. And when Europeans encountered, they had to sort out all kinds of language terms. And the word that got settled into usage was chief, and that got applied to everybody instead of king. Now, for some communities across the Americas, the word king did get used. in Pawnee land, I think that would have been very appropriate because these leaders, these Reisaru, they were for the most part hereditary leaders who came from the leading royal families, the leadership classes with the priesthoods and the leaders of the communities. And this was handed down in the families, this office of leadership, the Reisaru, and I've read different things about how that was done. It was handed to your sister's son, sometimes to your brother, and sometimes to other relatives. I think part of it was dependent on the qualities that a person had and if fit the model, the ideals of a Risaru. They were respected, they were esteemed, they were regal in quality. They attended to heavenly things, the celestial realms, and the religious ideas of what the life-giving life force in the universe intended for the world. And so that is sort of the background, the language background for Pawnee political systems. Now, well, I wanted to move a little closer in time to the founding of what's called the Little Kitgawkee. Now, the Little Kitgawkee was a group that was established, I think, sometime after about 1750, and was up and running by the 1790s. And so it evolved over time. This is a group that came together from mainly from the, and please excuse my pronunciation, Pitawiras. And so the Pitawiras, some of those members of that band got together and they established a new group that they drew in membership from all of the other Pawnee bands, including, I think, a few Skidis. And so this group was established as a separate group, a new political order. And so this is why the Kitgawkees are known as the Republican Pawnees, because the French fur traders, French and Spanish fur traders, when they observed what was going on, they attached this name, the Republic, to this new group, and it became attached to all of the Kitgawkee band and to the Republican River, where their main homeland was situated. And so this new group arose, and their ethic was a little different in government systems. Their ethic was that a person had to show leadership qualities and basically, by popular acclaim, gather the reins of power to become a leader. And so the little Kitgawkee leaders were more or less elected. And so what the French fur traders saw was comparable to the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And that's why they attached this name to this group, and it spread to all the Kitgawkees, but they weren't a Kitgawkee group. I think it's likely that over time they attracted more Kitgawkees, and then they became bound up in the politics of the Kitgawkee band and became a subgroup of that in time. But originally they were a separate group. And the leaders they were not hereditary leaders. They were democratically elected by the popularity of the character that these leaders had. And so this, I don't know if this introduced a new element in Pawnee political systems or if it emphasize something that was already there, which is that a man could become promoted through his deeds, through his actions, and eventually acquire a kind of a leadership role that was not hereditary. Now, this did not usurp in the other Pawnee bands the status of the royal leaders. And so I'm not sure exactly how these interface, but in the Little Kikaki, very different. And so that when the 1800s opens up, these are the options that are in place in Pawnee governance systems. Now, beginning maybe in the 1820s or so, we see a new set of historical circumstances, and this is the invasion of a new empire into Pawnee land. This was the Sioux invasion, and this brought a loss of control of valuable hunting lands in the far west and in the north, and ultimately in the south, to an invading network of families and bands and allies of theirs. And also war came with that. And now I don't know how this war arose, but it was very bloody, very violent. And the Pawnees lost ground to this invading empire. And one of the outcomes was a consolidation of the politics of the different Pawnee communities. At about 1800, we have maybe 5 different political systems. Each Pawnee band and the Little Kikaki, they're all separate from each other. They're basically like 5 independent nations that have complex relations with each other. Sometimes they're at war with each other. Not very often, but that did happen. And so we have these 5 independent communities that are, in the course of the opening decades of the 19th century, they're coming together. Now, there are other pressures as well. One of these pressures is epidemic disease that comes into Pawnee land. Now, this is not a new thing. I don't think this is a new thing. For example, influenza has always been around in Pawnee land, and every year a lot of people today die from influenza. The coronavirus is not an influenza, but it's I think they're all kind of distantly related. They're similar processes, at least. And so epidemic disease has always been a factor in Pawnee land, but then we have newly introduced epidemics like smallpox and cholera and things like that. So these epidemic experiences, together with the invasion of Pawnee land by the Sioux Empire, these help to bring about a consolidation of politics among the Pawnee bands. They are working out things and hunting together, going on their annual hunts together. They're also hunting with neighboring groups that are also affected by these same processes, like the Otos, the Omas and Ponkas. And so there's this an important set of regional relations that develops. And the Pawnees are not exactly allies with these other groups, but they have some friendly relations with some neighbors at some points. But the basic process that begins to happen is Pawnee political consolidation. And so this really begins to show up in the nature of Pawnee community life, in which we find communities that now are multi-band communities. And I think this starts with the joining of the Little Kikaki and the Kikaki by about 1820. And so after that point in time, there is a leadership group among the Skidis that's separate from the South Band Pawnees. The South Band Pawnees, they develop a system of leadership in which, when they need to conduct business among themselves, like going on a communal hunt, they designate a leader for that particular process in time. But basically, these are still more or less independent nations. The first treaties of the Pawnees with the United States, they take the form of 4 separate treaties in 1818. And so as of that date, they're still operating pretty much independently. The next treaty is in 1824 or 25. And this treaty has all the Pawnees lumped together. But I think this is an artificial process that was done by the United States as it negotiated with the Pawnees and didn't see the distinctions between them. But nevertheless, it does show that by this point in time, the Pawnees are developing mutual governmental systems. They're working with each other more. They're engaging in a unified political process, and they're living with each other. They're establishing communities where there are more than one band living there. And so by the 1840s, this process seems pretty well established. Now the Skidis are still living separately. Their governance group consists of about 31 leaders. Among the other South Band Pawnees, there are about, I think, 16 formal leaders. These are all hereditary leaders of the ruling classes, except among the Little Kitgaki. And so this is when we see the rise of what is called the Pawnee Confederation. I use that term to distinguish them from the Skidi Federation. And so the Pawnee Confederation really takes shape under the leadership of a Chowee Kitgaki family led, and now the name that appears in the records is Chief Malan. That's the name that's given to this man. He was from one of the leading families among the Chowees and the Kitgakis. Now his son is a man whose name is Pitere Saru, man chief. Pita, the word for man, Resaru, translated as chief. And you guys know what I mean when I say that. It refers to all these other more esoteric meanings that are difficult to translate. Now, when he was a young man, Pitere Saru, his father died in, I think, 1849, 1850, right around that time period. And he took over soon thereafter. When he was still a very young man, he was in his 20s, Pitere Saru, and he became the first, I guess you would think of as the first technical leader of the Pawnee Confederation. And this happened at the establishment of Pawnee City on the Many Wild Potatoes River in central Nebraska. They established a community near the Skidis, just a few miles away from it. Now, living with the Skidis at this point in time, there are some Pitawadas living there with them. But all the others, they established this community at a place called Pa'aku. the founding of the Skidi Federation occurs during the 1850s. Now the Pawnees are having a very intense war with the Sioux at this time. The Sioux Empire has moved in, and they are orchestrating, taking control of Pawnee hunting grounds, attacking Pawnee cities, sending large armies into Pawnee land to destroy cities and slaughter people and interfere with the hunt and do things like that. So the consolidation process was very important to the Pawnees for that reason, and because of disease epidemics devastating the Pawnee homeland. Now the Pawnees were also, in the course of these events, they were allying with another invading empire, the American Empire. The Pawnees were intermarried with Americans in a way that they were not with the Sioux. They were intermarried with Americans. They had extensive working trade relations with American officials operating out of what was called in the early days Redhead's Town, St. Louis. Redhead being William Clark of Lewis and Clark. And so the Pawnees developed these real working political relations for trade purposes with the American Empire. The American Empire, you know, when we look at American history, we read American history, we don't see the dynamics that we see when we look at it from a Pawnee perspective. From the Pawnee perspective, this is an empire of traders who are moving in. They're the families, the leading families in St. Louis are intermarrying with the leading families in Pawnee land. And the Pawnees are at war with the Sioux off and on. The Pawnees are battling with these disease epidemics. The population is in decline by this time. And by the 1840s, the early 1850s, the annual hunt, the 2 annual hunts that the Pawnees go on are beginning to decline because of hunting pressures from the invading empire of the Sioux. And so the Pawnees are starting to suffer their economy. They're suffering from disease epidemics. Their cities are being burned by the Sioux. So these are the traumatic events that cause the Pawnees to consolidate. And so at Pa'aku, we see the first unified community. Now, it was not very unified. It was scattered over maybe a 6 or 7 mile stretch of the river. And it had various neighborhoods. It had 5 neighborhoods and 3 South bands, and then the Skidi community with some more South bands living there. Now, one thing that the Pawnees decided that they would do is they saw the other regional nations making agreements with the United States for control of different lands around the region. The Pawnees were not invited to a major consultation that was held in 1853 to divvy up things. The Pawnees were excluded from that. So there was a lot of treaty maneuvering going on during the early to mid 1850s. And the Pawnees were excluded, and they got together and said, well, we need to ensure that we have our own homeland. And so they started negotiating with the United States to establish a treaty under which the guaranteed homeland would be established in Nebraska. And so they set forth the provisions through negotiation, the provisions of the Treaty of 1857. And then the Pawnee sent a delegation of Pawnee leaders to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress, to lobby the Senate to ratify that treaty. There was a Pawnee who died and was buried in Washington, D.C. And so this is how the Pawnee Reservation was established. The Pawnees wanted it. They had seen part of their land sold off by the Omahas in an agreement with the United States. And they knew they had to take their own actions to guarantee the establishment of a Pawnee homeland. And so they did that. Now, we mentioned Baptiste Bayel last time. Now, Baptiste Bayel, he went off to St. Louis at about age 14 or so. And while he was in St. Louis, he met and married a woman named Virginia. What was her last name?
O'Brien.
Well, that might be her, but I'm thinking Kitty O'Brien was the wife of William Bayel.
Oh, I see.
I need to take a look at that. I'm not very, so you could be right about that. But he married this woman, Virginia, and they moved back to Pawnee land during the 1850s as these events are unfolding. And his brother, Frank Detier, was working with the Pawnees as an interpreter at the time. Now, Baptiste Bayel moved to a town, what Louis Bayel said. They moved to this little town called St. Mary's. Now, that's not on any map. St. Mary's fell into the Missouri River, I think, during the 1880s. It's just a small community.
What state?
It was, it might have even been Iowa, in the Iowa side of the mysterious river. That's the Pawnee name for this river, the Missouri River. And so he lived in this little town, and there were other relatives and people intermarried with different communities and from families from St. Louis. And he lived in this little town with his wife, Virginia. She was part Spanish and part French. And I don't know, as we discussed before, the specifics of Bayel's own ancestry. He had a Pawnee mother, and his father was from St. Louis, probably French with Spanish ancestry in there. And so he appears first in 1859 with the establishment of the Pawnee Reservation. There's a community of Mormons who think they've got the right to set up what they call a way station, and they call it Genoa. They set up this way station, and they are planting their crops, and they are there for a period of months. They've built some buildings, and then one day they're holding church services, and these Pawnees show up in the back of the room. Baptiste Bayel is the interpreter. He says, okay, you guys, we're setting up shop right here. You guys have to move out. You're on Pawnee land. And so this is the founding of what's called, there are various names for this city. I call it Wild Licorice Creek. The Pawnee name, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's something like Kitspilatus. This is the name of a plant that grows on a creek that has another Pawnee name called Beaver Creek. Beaver Creek and this wild licorice, those are the two interchangeable names. So Genoa is the name that entered the American consciousness and became a popular name. But in Pawnee land, the Pawnees called it Beaver Creek and Wild Licorice Creek. And I just like that name, Wild Licorice Creek. I like that name, so I prefer to call it that. Now, the Pawnees set up shop here. Why is that? I think the reason is this. Baptiste Mayo was the translator. That tells me something. He was Skidi. He was a Skidi interpreter. The Skidis took the lead on this, on establishing this community at Wild Licorice Creek. Here's why. Because in their oral traditions, the founding of the Skidi Confederacy took place on Beaver Creek. And so this city, the last Pawnee metropolitan center in their ancient homeland, was established right where the Skidi Federation had its origin story. This is the Skidi Confederation acting on this old tradition of this is where the Skidi political system comes from, and we're going to attach ourselves to that tradition and be a unified people under the leadership of Peter Saru. And so this is how the Pawnee Reservation got established. And I think the reason why it got established, where it got established. Okay, so now things go on. Pawnee removal happens. The Pawnee population is still in decline. The war with the Sioux is going on. Things are not looking good for the Pawnees. The Pawnees initiated removal to Oklahoma. At the end of 1872, some Pawnees decided, well, we're not too happy with the way things are going in our ancient homeland. We're going to go down and we're going to meet with communities off to the south in this homeland. It's an ancient homeland of related peoples. The Pawnees had removed down there. The Skidis had removed to the Red River in Oklahoma during the 1770s. For a couple of years, they lived down there in several different locations along the Red River, along the southern border of Oklahoma. So the Pawnees saw this as the far reaches of what can be arguably referred to as Pawnee land. That's why I tend not to have a very specific definition of what Pawnee land is. It's a set of ideas that keep changing through time that are rooted in this history. So a group of Skidis removed down there, and they lived for a few years, and then they came back. And this is reflected in some Pawnee oral traditions that I talk about in my book, Community and Confederacy in Pawnee Land. And so one of Walter Dees, his father was named Bear Chief. Bear Chief's father was named Spotted Horse. Spotted Horse was a Skidi who was born after the Skidis lived in Oklahoma. On their way back, some of them decided they would visit St. Louis, and that's where Spotted Horse was born, in St. Louis. Now, St. Louis, I've characterized it as a French, Spanish, American city, but here's what it really was. It was a Pawnee city. When you look at the early census records for the residents of St. Louis, you find a scattering of Pawnees are married to those families already during the 1760s, 1770s. St. Louis was not a foreign city to the Pawnees. It was at the edges of Pawnee land. And in fact, in ancient times, a group of ancestors lived right there at the mouth of the mysterious river and the Dark River. where the mysterious river runs into the dark river. That's where some Pawnees lived in ancient times. They moved up mysterious river to join to join other people living in the Central Plains. And so these are all in the Pawnee traditions and a sense of the Pawnee world as these far-flung connections to the Rocky Mountains, to the far southern plains, and to the Mississippi River. And so this is sort of like part of the circle of realms that ultimately should be part of our identities as Pawnees. And so Spotted Horse, he became a leader among the Skidis, but he was hated. He was not well liked. And he had a falling out in 1844, I think it was, with one of the missionaries' sons. And the missionary's son had a fight with him, and he chopped off his hand. And the Skidis refused to help Spotted Horse because he was so despised. And he died. And that was the father of Bear Chief, who was the father of Walter Keyes. So we have family connections that
Wow.
lead into that story. And so what I'm saying is that the Pawnees and their governmental systems, the Pawnees took things in hand. They were not helpless victims of manipulations by either invading empire. They had an impact, a big impact, both of these empires. But the Pawnee political systems are mostly need to be understood as internal systems run by the Pawnees. Maybe I'll conclude by trying to say a little bit about what happened during the final decades of the 19th century, because that's kind of mysterious to me. There's the Pawnee Confederation. It's led by Pitere Saru. Now he is killed in the course of Pawnee removal. He accidentally shoots himself and he doesn't recover from that. Now there's various stories about that, but he died, and his name was Sun Chief. He took over leadership of the Confederation, but I think it kind of fell apart for various reasons. Now I'm in the dark about what happened. But the last technical meeting of the Chiefs Society, the Risaru Society, there's a name for it that I can't pronounce. Their last meeting was held before the death of Sun Chief, and he died, I think it was in 1888. And so the Pawnee Confederation kind of falls apart. But there are still leaders. There's still a system. It's just not the same by this time. And I think what's going on is the overall population decline causes ceremonial losses. It causes a change in the economic system. It causes various cultural changes. The integration of the Little Kitkaki and the Kitkaki leads to the formation of a new group in which the Little Kitkaki leader is treated as the second chief of the band. And so there are things going on that I'm not real clear on, in which things fall into disarray, but certain systems continue. And I think this is based on the hereditary leading families. They do their best to carry on, despite the awful decline in population that happens throughout this period. and then the coming of the American political system with the establishment of the land run in 1893 and the establishment of an Oklahoma territory around that time period. Again, I'm not real clear on this history, but statehood in 1907 also played a factor in this. And so there's this overall decline in Pawnee religious, ceremonial, and cultural systems that is at work. And nevertheless, there are fragments of it enduring. And so we see leadership, we see band leadership getting together to conduct official business on the part of the Pawnee community. But I have the sense that their old traditions have gone into serious decline. And so the old Confederacy system with 16 leaders led by a head leader, that's no longer in operation, but there's an alternate system that slowly rises and takes shape and continues. So with that, we will, next time we can go into some of the developments of the Pawnee political system as they unfolded with the coming of a constitutional democracy in 1938. That's my overview of the long perspective of, and there's so many gaps, so many things I don't know, but this is what I've pieced together as best as I can. Other historians who have looked at this might well debate with me on various aspects of this. But I would be very interested to hear what alternate opinions there are, as opposed to the perspective I've laid out, the scholarship by others. I didn't spell out very clearly the dynamics of Pawnee removal, which was initiated and carried out by the Pawnees as a life-saving measure as they saw it. And so I wish I would have said a little bit more about that, but that can be another topic for another time too.
First off, thanks so much, Roger. The way at the beginning of this session, an interesting point to me was that the term for priest, which is, I would say, kuruhus, also is used contemporarily as just a old man, like that old guy, or to tease men, which is sort of in total contrast to its original meaning. So I wonder when that changeover happened.
Well, I think that's translation, old man. But the ultimate meaning of it is that the old men were they were the educated people who carried on the traditional knowledge. These were like the college professors of Pawnee land, as opposed to the political leaders and as opposed to the doctors. So you have those three different classes that sometimes they overlap. A person could be in more than one of those groups, but generally they were separate classes. In the priesthood, these were the highly educated knowledge keepers, the keepers of the traditions of Pawnee land. And so that's why this term old man became associated with, I don't know, like you'd refer to these guys as a gurus, as we would a PhD,
Okay, well, thank you very much again. Appreciated it.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for hearing me out. And as this settles in and you guys think about what we've talked about, I would be very interested in hearing, subjects, topics that you guys would want to bring up too. So I'm hopeful that maybe we can get together again maybe in some kind of a quasi-regular fashion every once in a while, and choose a topic and go over it in some detail. But thanks for listening and joining in.